My husband left his empire to me. My Stepson sued, claiming I was an uneducated housewife who manipulated him. He hired the city's top lawyer to destroy me. As I entered the courtroom, the opposing lawyer turned pale, dropped his briefcase, and bowed. "It is really you. I can't believe it." I stifled a laugh and said who I truly was. Jonathan Pierce looked like he had seen a ghost rising from the mahogany floor. Trevor's smug face curdled into a mask of pure confusion. The room held its breath while the air conditioner hummed a low, mechanical note. My navy dress felt heavy, a shroud for the woman they thought they knew. Jonathan had been my brightest student, the one who grasped the nuance of constitutional law before he could drink. Now he stood trembling, his professional armor shattered by a single glance. Trevor gripped the edge of his table until his knuckles turned ivory white. He expected a victim. Instead, he found the very architect of the law. I sat at the defense table and smoothed my hair with a steady hand. My wedding ring caught the harsh fluorescent light, a reminder of Richard's secret request. He had known Trevor would strike like a viper once the soil was fresh on the grave. For 20 years, I played the quiet companion, pouring tea and nodding at dinner parties. I buried my credentials deep in a locked basement safe. Now, the weight of my past filled the room. Jonathan still had not picked up his pens. Judge Miller entered with a sharp crack of the gavel that echoed off the high ceilings. He looked down from the bench, his eyes narrowing as they landed on my face. A flicker of recognition crossed his features, followed by a visible gulp. The power dynamic shifted without a single word being spoken. Trevor leaned toward Jonathan, whispering frantic, angry questions that went unanswered. The top lawyer in the city was frozen in place. He knew exactly what was coming for his client. "I am representing myself today, Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the stifling silence. The sound was melodic and dangerous. I watched the court reporter's fingers pause over the keys. Trevor finally found his voice and began to shout about my lack of a degree. He did not see the judge's face turn a deep shade of crimson. Jonathan finally reached for his fallen briefcase, but his hands would not stop shaking. The uneducated housewife had just vanished before their very eyes. I opened my leather folder to reveal a stack of Supreme Court opinions I had authored. The paper felt crisp, a sharp weapon against their petty greed. Trevor reached for a glass of water, but he missed the mark. The glass tipped over, soaking his expensive silk tie in an instant. He looked at the mess, then back at me, finally seeing the predator in the room. I gave him a small, cold smile that never reached my eyes. The real trial was finally about to begin. The damp patch on Trevor's tie darkened as he struggled to breathe. I ignored his gasping and turned my attention back to the judge. The courtroom smelled of lemon wax and stale coffee. My objective was simple. I had to dismantle the forgery Trevor had used to start this fire. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the bench. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. The air felt heavy and cold. "Proceed, Justice Stone," the judge whispered into the microphone. His voice carried an unusual tremor. Trevor's face drained of color at the mention of my title. He turned to Jonathan with a desperate, silent plea for help. Jonathan merely stared at the floor, his hands still trembling. He knew the protocol for a witness like me. I stepped toward the center of the room. Every eye followed the rhythmic click of my heels. The power had shifted entirely. I pulled a single yellowed document from my leather folder. It was the original will Richard signed in my presence. Trevor had filed a copy with 3 suspicious alterations. I walked toward the plaintiff's table with a measured, predatory grace. Jonathan flinched when I placed the paper before him. He recognized the watermark immediately. It was the mark of the state's highest legal office. Richard had secured our future with my own seal. Trevor let out a small, high-pitched whimper. Is this the signature you claim was forged, Jonathan? I asked quietly. My voice was like velvet draped over a razor. Jonathan looked at the ink and then back at me. He was trapped between his career and his client's lies. The room grew so quiet I could hear Trevor's watch ticking. Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. He did not answer. He knew that lying to me was a one-way ticket to disbarment. Trevor suddenly lunged for the paper, his fingers clawing at the mahogany. Jonathan caught his wrist just in time to stop the theft. The judge hammered his gavel with a thunderous strike. Security officers moved in from the back of the room. Trevor began to scream that I had stolen his life. His eyes were wide and bloodshot with panic. He looked nothing like the Empire's heir. He looked like a cornered animal. The judge signaled for silence. "You are in contempt, Mr. Stone," the judge barked. Trevor collapsed back into his chair and sobbed. I watched him without a shred of pity in my heart. He had gambled with Richard's honor and lost everything. I turned my gaze back to the bench to finish the job. There was one more secret hidden in the folder. It was a digital recording Richard made before he died. It contained Trevor's confession of debt. The room waited for my next move. I reached for the small silver drive in the folder. My fingers felt cool and steady against the metal. Jonathan saw the drive and closed his eyes in defeat. He knew the contents would destroy Trevor's remaining defense. I looked at Trevor, who was now staring at me with pure hatred. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photo. It was a picture of me from 30 years ago. He smiled a jagged, terrifying smile. The crumpled photograph shook in Trevor's trembling hand. It showed me standing before the High Court, young and defiant. My goal was to silence his desperate blackmail before it reached the jury. I stepped closer to the bench, my shadow stretching across the floor. Trevor's jagged smile widened, revealing a row of stained teeth. He thought a relic from my past could break my resolve. The air in the room grew heavy with his unspoken, poisonous threat. "This woman lived a double life," Trevor hissed. He held the photo high for the judge to see. Jonathan looked away, refusing to participate in this low act. I didn't flinch or look at the image. Instead, I tapped the silver drive against the mahogany table. The sound was sharp, like a small bone snapping. The judge peered over his spectacles, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance. Trevor's bravado was a thin, brittle veil for his rising fear. I gestured for the bailiff to take the silver drive. "Your Honor, the truth is not in a photograph." My voice remained a calm, steady blade. The judge nodded and signaled for the technician to start the video. The screen on the wall flickered to life with a soft hum. Trevor's smile vanished as Richard's face appeared in high definition. The lighting was soft, but Richard's gaze was hard. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Richard spoke from the screen with a clarity that felt haunting. He described Trevor's hidden debts and the threats made against our home. Every word was a hammer blow to Trevor's collapsing case. I watched Trevor's shoulders slump as the evidence mounted. He dropped the old photograph, and it fluttered to the carpet. The legal tide was turning into a violent flood. Jonathan sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the screen. Trevor looked utterly broken. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the courtroom. The heavy doors swung open, hitting the stone walls with force. A tall man in a dark suit walked in with purpose. He carried a red folder marked with the state treasury seal. Trevor's head snapped around, his eyes widening in recognition. This was not part of my careful plan. I felt a cold chill settle deep in my bones. The power balance shifted again. The man ignored the guards and walked straight to the judge. He handed over the red folder without saying a single word. Judge Miller opened the seal and read the first page in silence. His face went from pale to a deep, angry red. He looked at me, then at Trevor, then back at the folder. My pulse quickened as I realized something was terribly wrong. This new obstacle was larger than Trevor's petty greed. The judge sighed. "Justice Stone, we have a problem," the judge stated. He tapped the red folder against the bench. Trevor began to laugh, a dry and hollow sound. It was the laugh of a man who had a second plan. I realized then that Richard had not told me everything. The man in the suit turned to face me. He held out a badge that gleamed in the light. My heart stopped. Federal agents were now involved in my husband's empire. The agent stood like a statue in the center of the court. His badge caught the overhead glare, casting a sharp light across my desk. My objective was to maintain control over the proceedings, despite this sudden federal intrusion. Trevor leaned back, his eyes gleam with a new, dark confidence. He knew something I did not. The judge was still reading the red folder with a grim expression. I felt the courtroom air turn thin and very cold. "This is a matter of national security," the agent declared. He did not look at me. Trevor chuckled and wiped the remaining tears from his cheeks. He gestured toward the red folder with a mocking flourish. I realized then that Richard's empire held secrets far beyond mere money. The judge looked up, his face etched with deep lines of worry. The power I had just reclaimed felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Something was very wrong. Image of a federal agent badge. I stepped toward the bench, my voice a low, steady command. "Explain the relevance to this probate case, agent." The man turned slowly, his eyes as blank as slate. He did not seem impressed by my title or my past. Trevor's laugh turned into a loud, grating bark. He was no longer the broken child I had just examined. He was an informant. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Richard was being investigated. The agent handed me a single sheet from the red folder. It was a wire transfer, receipt signed by Richard 3 weeks before his death. The destination was an account linked to a sanctioned foreign entity. My hand did not shake, but my blood ran cold. Trevor had not forged this. He had simply waited for the government to do his dirty work. The judge sighed and rubbed his tired eyes. The room was deathly silent once again. "Your husband was not the man you knew, Nicole," Trevor whispered. He used my first name like a weapon. I looked at the receipt, then at the silver drive still plugged into the computer. If the empire was built on illegal funds, the will was worthless. Every asset would be frozen by the state. Jonathan Pierce looked at me with genuine pity. He knew I was facing a total collapse. My husband's legacy was a lie. I scanned the receipt again, looking for any flaw in the document. My eyes landed on the timestamp at the very bottom. Richard was in surgery during that exact hour. He could not have signed a digital wire transfer from the operating table. I looked at Trevor and saw a flicker of hesitation in his gaze. He had overplayed his hand. The agent was waiting for my reaction. I felt a surge of cold, calculated fury. "This signature is a digital clone," I stated firmly. The agent narrowed his eyes. Trevor's smug expression began to crack at the edges once again. I turned the paper toward the judge and pointed at the metadata logs. Trevor had used Richard's bypass codes while my husband was under anesthesia. The agent stepped closer, the interest piqued by my observation. Just then, a second agent entered the room. He was carrying a set of heavy steel handcuffs. The handcuffs glinted under the lights as the second agent marched toward the front. My objective was to pinpoint the exact source of the forged metadata before the court was adjourned. Trevor's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He stared at the metal restraints as if they were a death sentence. I kept my gaze fixed on the timestamp. The judge leaned over his bench, waiting for a definitive answer. The room remained perfectly still. The digital logs held the only truth left. "This log shows an entry from the hospital cafeteria," I said. I pointed to the IP address listed on the secondary sheet. Trevor's eyes darted toward the exit. The first agent took the paper from me and studied the numbers. He pulled a small tablet from his pocket to verify the location. I felt a surge of adrenaline as the trap began to close. Trevor had been sloppy in his greed. He believed he was smarter than the law itself. The agent looked at Trevor with a new, dangerous curiosity. "Were you at the hospital that day, Mr. Stone?" Trevor tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He looked at Jonathan, who was now packing his bags to leave. Jonathan would not protect a federal target. The power in the room had shifted away from the probate dispute. This was now a criminal investigation. I stood my ground, waiting for the final collapse. Trevor's hands began to shake violently. "I was just getting a coffee." Trevor finally stammered. His voice was thin and brittle. The agent smiled. But it was not a friendly gesture. It was the look of a shark scenting blood in the water. He noted that the cafeteria had surveillance cameras in every corner. Trevor's facade broke completely. He slumped into his chair, defeated by his own digital trail. The judge watched the scene with a cold, professional detachment. The federal agents moved closer to Trevor. The second agent reached out and grabbed Trevor by the shoulder. "You are under arrest for identity theft and wire fraud." The heavy click of the handcuffs echoed through the chamber. Trevor did not fight back this time. He looked like a child who had finally been caught. I felt a brief moment of relief, but it was short. The first agent turned back to me with a stern expression. He held a second red folder. "The story was not over yet. Justice Stone, we need to discuss the hospital logs," the agent stated. He opened the folder to reveal a medical report I had never seen. It was Richard's private toxicology results. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scanned the lines. There were traces of a sedative that Richard was never prescribed. I looked at Trevor, but he was already being led away. Someone else had been at that hospital. The room felt suddenly very small and quite dangerous. I looked at the signature on the toxicology report. It was not a doctor I recognized from our regular team. The ink was fresh, and the date was from this morning. My husband had been gone for months. I realized with a jolt of terror that someone was still tampering with the evidence. The agent's phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen with a frown. He turned to me, his face pale. "Someone just breached your basement safe, Nicole." The cold report in my hand felt like a sheet of ice. My objective was to secure the courthouse and reach my home before the thief vanished with the truth. The federal agent gripped his radio, while his eyes scanned the gallery for a second threat. Trevor was already gone, dragged toward the holding cells in a state of shock. I thought I had won the war, but the breach at my house suggested a deeper conspiracy. The air smelled of panic and ozone. A heavy silence descended on the room. "Lock the exits now," the agent barked into his lapel microphone. He looked at me with a grim, calculating expression. I grabbed my leather folder and prepared to move. The safe in my basement contained more than just law degrees and robes. It held Richard's private ledgers from his early days in the tech sector. Those books were the only things that could explain the foreign wire transfers. If they were gone, my husband's name would be permanently stained. I felt a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. The judge hammered his gavel 3 times to restore a semblance of order. He signaled for the bailiffs to escort the remaining spectators out of the side doors. Jonathan Pierce stood by his chair, looking paralyzed by the sudden turn of events. I moved toward him, my voice a sharp and urgent whisper. Who else knew about the operating room codes? Jonathan. He swallowed hard and looked toward the back of the room. His silence was an admission of guilt or terror. The courtroom felt like a sinking ship. A new figure emerged from the shadows near the clerk's desk. It was the head of Richard's security team, a man named Marcus. He was supposed to be guarding my estate, yet here he stood in a suit. He held a small, black remote that belonged to my home alarm system. I realized then that the breach was an inside job from within our circle. The power shifted as Marcus stepped toward the federal agent. He looked neither afraid nor surprised. He looked like a man finishing a job. "The safe is empty, Nicole," Marcus said with a cold, flat tone. He tossed the remote onto the defense table. The plastic rattled against the wood like a dying insect. My heart stopped as I processed the theft of the ledgers. Marcus had been with Richard for a decade. He knew every secret, every debt, and every hidden vault in our lives. The federal agent stepped back, his hand hovering near his holster. We were all caught in a web of old loyalties and new betrayals. The agent's radio crackled with a frantic message from the local police. They had spotted a black sedan leaving my driveway at high speed. The driver was wearing a medical mask and scrub suit. I looked at the toxicology report again, my eyes burning with a new realization. The doctor who signed the report was not a stranger at all. It was Marcus's brother, a disgraced surgeon who had vanished years ago. The conspiracy was a family business. Trevor was merely a convenient, loud distraction for their silent theft. "You poisoned him," I whispered, my voice thick with a sudden, jagged grief. Marcus didn't deny it. He simply adjusted his silk tie and looked at the clock on the wall. He was waiting for something to happen. The agent grabbed Marcus by the arm. But Marcus didn't struggle against the hold. He pointed toward the large screen, where Richard's video was still frozen. A new window popped up on the display, showing a live feed of my basement. A small incendiary device was ticking on the floor. Image of an electronic timer circuit diagram. I lunged for the technician's laptop to stop the sequence. The agent tried to pull me back, but I was faster. My fingers flew across the keys, searching for the override code Richard had taught me. The room was a blur of motion and shouting voices. Marcus laughed. A dry sound that chilled my blood to the core. The judge called for an immediate evacuation of the entire courthouse. I saw the timer hit 10 seconds. The screen flickered with a strange, green line of code. The code was not a bomb sequence at all. It was a mass data transmission. Every file in the basement safe was being uploaded to an anonymous cloud server. Marcus was not trying to burn my house down. He was stealing the identity of the entire empire to sell it. The agent realized the truth too late. As the upload hit 100%, my house alarm let out a final, distant wail. I looked up and saw Jonathan Pierce holding a matching black remote. He had been the architect all along. Jonathan Pierce held the black remote with a steady, clinical grip. My objective shifted from saving the physical files to severing the digital link before the empire was sold to the highest bidder. The air in the courtroom felt electrified and poisonous. I looked at Jonathan, my former protege, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. He had orchestrated the legal assault as a cover for this technological heist. The federal agent lunged for Jonathan, but Marcus blocked the path with a violent, practiced shove. The betrayal was absolute. The tech on the wall continued its green, flickering dance. Every proprietary secret Richard had built was now flowing into a dark web abyss. I grabbed the technician's mouse and tried to initiate a hard system crash. The cursor blinked once, and then froze under a secondary encryption layer. Jonathan smiled, an expression that held no warmth or apology. He had learned his cold logic from me, but he had twisted it into a weapon of pure greed. The room felt like it was closing in around my throat. "I learned from the best." "Justice Stone," Jonathan said. His voice was smooth and utterly devoid of remorse. He pressed a final button on his remote, and the screen turned a deep, blood red. The upload was complete. Marcus began to back away toward the side exit, his job finished. The federal agent was pinned against the clerk's desk, struggling with two of Marcus's men who had appeared from the gallery. This was no longer a trial. It was a calculated, high-stakes execution of a legacy. I reached into the hidden pocket of my navy dress. My fingers brushed against a small, cold object Richard had given me on our last anniversary, It was a physical kill. Switch for the entire corporate network. Richard had always feared an inside job by his own security team. I pulled the device out and jammed it into the laptop's USB port. A blue light flared, and the red screen began to crack with lines of white static. Jonathan's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, sudden panic. The white static on the screen began to form words in a language only I understood. Richard had written a recursive delete program that only my biometric thumbprint could activate. I pressed my thumb against the glowing sensor on the kill switch. The courtroom speakers emitted a low, mournful tone as the data started to vanish from the cloud server. Jonathan rushed toward me, his face a mask of fury. He realized his entire future was being erased in real time. The power had shifted back to the housewife. "Stop the deletion, Nicole." Jonathan screamed. He reached for my wrist, but I sighed, stepped him with a sharp, fluid motion. The federal agent finally broke free and tackled Marcus to the ground. The room was a chaotic blur of shouting and struggling bodies. I kept my thumb pressed firmly against the sensor until the screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The empire was gone, but so was the evidence of Richard's alleged crimes. The ledgers were now nothing but digital dust. The agent pulled Jonathan away from me and forced him into a chair. Marcus was already in heavy restraints, his face pressed against the cold marble floor. I stood by the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. The judge stood up and looked at the carnage in his courtroom. He seemed to have aged 20 years in a single hour. He looked at me with a question in his eyes. I gave him a slow, weary nod. The threat was neutralized. But the cost was staggering. Security teams flooded the room, their boots thudding against the carpet. They began to sweep the area for any secondary devices or hidden threats. I sat back down at the defense table and let out a long, shaky breath. My husband's empire was functionally dead, but his honor was safe. I looked at the black remote Jonathan had dropped during the struggle. It was still blinking with a small, yellow light. I realized then that the deletion had triggered a secondary, automated response. Something was wrong. The judge cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the room. "Is the data secure?" "Justice Stone." I looked at the blinking yellow light on the remote. It was a countdown, but not for an explosion or an upload. It was a broadcast signal. Richard had built a final fail safe that sent the entire truth to every major news outlet in the country. He wanted the world to know what Trevor and Jonathan had done. The television in the corner suddenly flickered to life. My face was on the news. The news anchor was describing a massive data leak involving a Supreme Court justice and a corporate conspiracy. I watched the screen in horror as private photos and documents began to scroll across the bottom of the display. Richard had intended to protect me, but his program had no filter. The uneducated housewife was now the center of a global scandal. Jonathan began to laugh. A wild and broken sound that echoed through the chamber. Trevor walked back into the room, led by a guard. He was smiling. "Hugh. Hugh. Kuti suki ku hiksu ku ki." The television broadcast felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My objective was to kill the broadcast signal before our private lives became public entertainment. I scrambled for the remote Jonathan had dropped. But my fingers slipped on the polished wood. Trevor watched the screen with a hungry, desperate intensity. The news anchor began reading the list of offshore accounts Richard had supposedly managed. Each name felt like a hammer strike against my husband's gravestone. The room was spinning out of control. Jonathan laughed from his chair, a jagged sound that filled the empty spaces. "You can't stop the truth once it's digital. Nicole." I ignored him and focused on the flickering hub under the judge's desk. If I could sever the main fiber line, the leak might stop locally. I dived under the mahogany wood, my knees scraping the carpet. Cables tangled around my arms like plastic vines. I found the glowing orange port and yanked the glass wire free. The monitor went dark. The courtroom fell into a sudden, eerie silence as the hum of the electronics died. I crawled out from under the desk, my navy dress stained with dust. Trevor was no longer smiling. He realized that the data was not just about Richard. It included his own forged signatures. He looked at the federal agent with a new, hollow kind of terror. Jonathan's face hardened into a mask of pure spite. He had lost his prize, but he had ruined me too. Image of an optical fiber cable structure. The agent's phone chirped with a priority alert from the State House. He looked at me, then at the frozen screen, his expression unreadable. The leak did not come from Richard's server. He stated slowly. I froze, my hand still gripping the severed cable. Trevor's head snapped toward the agent in total shock. We all looked at Jonathan, but he seemed just as confused. A secondary party was controlling the flow of information. The conspiracy had a ghost in the machine. Marcus began to struggle against his zip ties, his eyes fixed on the back door. I realized then that Richard's security team had a silent partner we never considered. My first husband. A man I thought was dead for a decade appeared on the gallery monitor. He was sitting in a sunlit room, holding a glass of scotch. His face was older, but the cruelty in his eyes was identical. He winked at the camera and toasted the room. Richard was his final mark. The federal agent reached for his weapon, but the courtroom doors locked with a heavy, electronic thud. We were trapped in the very theater where I had tried to find justice. My heart hammered a rhythm of pure dread against my ribs. The man on the screen started to speak my maiden name with terrifying affection. Trevor began to scream, but the sound was muffled by the thickening air. I looked at the gavel on the floor. It was over. Trevor was not the enemy.